Welcome in the Vikings Now. I am your host, Patrick Seatman. We got some great and breaking news that we'll be breaking down on today's video. As you guys see by the title and the little bar right there, the Vikings have hired Brian Flores to be their next defensive coordinator. And I am absolutely ecstatic because coming into today, I was getting a little nervous because it was coming down to Brian Flores and Mike Pettin after Sean Desai withdrew his name from the defensive coordinator search, after Ejiro Evero got the job in Carolina, and then also Ryan Nielsen got the job in Atlanta from the New Orleans Saints. But Adam Schefter, he was the first one to break the news, saying Steelers assistant coach Brian Flores is accepting the Vikings defensive coordinator job per source. Then Ian Rappaport followed that up by sources are saying the Vikings are set to hire Steelers senior defensive assistant and linebackers coach Brian Flores as their new defensive and coordinator. He impressed them from the beginning and now lands in Minnesota with the task of improving their defense. And that defense was awful this past year. We'll get into some of the stats later on in today's video, but talk about flipping it on its head. Going from Ed Donatel, a guy who rarely blitzes, plays that soft zone coverage, to a guy like Brian Flores who is uber aggressive. I want you guys to get down to the comments. I'll make this the pinned comment on today's video and grade the hire of Brian Flores. If an ad break comes, take advantage of it. Hop down in the comments and grade the hire of Brian Flores. Give me an A, B, C, D, or F. Like I was saying, Brian Flores, or coming from Ed Donatel and now going to Brian Flores, clap it up for Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah. Talk about being self-aware. What the Vikings lacked last year is an aggressive defense where you trusted your corners, where you weren't sitting in that soft zone coverage play after play after play, which the Vikings were last season. And now you bring in a guy like Brian Flores, who is going to be uber aggressive, who is great against the runs, who is great blitzing sets, and that will really change life, I believe, on the defensive side of the football in Minnesota. This was my number one hire from the jump. This was who I wanted to bring in. And Brian Flores, right now, he was obviously hired as the Vikings defensive coordinator on Monday. He interviewed with Minnesota all the way last week, which is why I was kind of getting nervous that he wasn't our guy because of the delay of the hire. He was actually the favorite, according to most sports books, to land the head coaching job in Arizona, and he was also considered a candidate for the Broncos defensive coordinator search, which I was actually nervous he was going to end up going there just because he could team up with Sean Payton and kind of form a sort of kind of superstar, super team coaching staff over there in Denver, which I know Sean Payton has talked about in the past. But this is great. Vikings are bringing in Brian Flores. He started off his NFL career with the New England Patriots as a special team assistant. He was an offensive assistant and special team coach still with New England. He worked his way up. He was a defensive assistant here. Then he was a safeties coach. Then he was a linebackers coach. And then finally in 2019, he got the head coaching position with the Miami Dolphins for 3 seasons. And then this past year, he was the senior defensive assistant and the linebackers coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Overall, I think this is a great hire. We're going to dive into kind of more about Flores and more about the stats from the Vikings this past season here in a second. But make sure you guys are subscribed because this is going to be a crazy offseason. This was kind of the first domino to fall. And now I think it's going to get into the cut candidates around the guys like Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, Harrison Smith, and Eric Hendricks. These are guys that the Vikings are most likely going to be cutting in this offseason. So make sure you guys are subscribed and turn on those notifications so you don't miss a thing. Just that little bell right there really helps us out. Go down there, hit that subscribe button. We're closing in on 11,000 subs. So I'm going to be asking, why Flores? Why is he such an upgrade from a guy like Ed Donatel? Overall, I think he's a great defensive mind. He still runs that 3-4 front that Ed Donatel brought in last year. We saw the growing pains at the beginning of last season with this Vikings defense, but that big difference is that third line right here, the one I'm pointing to, is the heavy blitz packages that Brian Flores brings, and then the really strong run-stopping sets, what the Vikings did struggle with against last season. And I said this from the jump. This was the aggressive choice. Knowing that Brian Flores most likely won't be on the Vikings coaching staff for many years, and this will probably be a 1 to 2 year rental until he goes and gets another head coaching position, this was the aggressive choice. I love the move. Brian Flores is your new Vikings defensive coordinator. We're going to get into more of this later on. Vikings Now is sponsored by Athletic Greens. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens literally every day. Get comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition at athleticgreens.com/chatsports. I gave AG1 a try because I wanted sustained energy and wanted a supplement that actually tastes great. I take AG1 in the morning, and it makes me feel ready to take on my day. I started taking AG1 at the start of the new year. It really helps me sustain my energy throughout the day so I can feel strong and ready to go for my workout after work. Covering my nutritional basis for the day literally couldn't be easier, which is why I trust Athletic Greens. I just mix one small scoop of AG1 with water and drink it first thing each morning. Done. I also like that it costs less than $3 a day. Pretty good if you ask me. It's a really effective daily habit with the highest quality sourced ingredients. That's a win-win. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/chatsports. That's athleticgreens.com/chatsports. Check it out. The link is in the comments and description of today's video. If you're looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers defensive ranks this past year, nothing that's really going to jump off the page to you guys. They were still top 10 in points per game, sitting at 12th in yards per game, giving them around 330. Yards per play around 5.5 at 20th, and then yards per rush at 4.2, top 10 in the NFL. And most of this was without TJ Watt out, and he was still able to get it done, being that linebackers coach and head defensive assistant for the Pittsburgh Steelers this past season. I think he's really going to change life in Minnesota on the defensive side of football. Just overall philosophy is going to be completely different. The philosophy that we saw and just how the Vikings played ball on that side of the football, it's going to be completely different. We saw a team that had their corners at 10 yards off the wide receivers most of the plays on the defensive side of the football. And now we're going to see a little more press. We're going to see a little more man. We're going to see a lot more blitz packages. We're going to see a very more aggressive style of play from this Vikings defense, which I think is needed. Because if you look at the Vikings stats this past season, I mean, if you looked at this and you just said, what do you think the Vikings record was this past season? You would think this is a team that's drafting top 5 in the NFL draft. Points per game, 25.5. That was 30th in the NFL. Yards per game, you're almost giving up 400 yards per game, second to last in the NFL. Almost 6 yards per play, 30th in the NFL. Rush yards per game, 124, and then passing yards per game, yes, that's true, 266.9 yards per game. That was second to last in the NFL. This was overall a great hire from our Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings defense last year was really the Achilles heel and was really the biggest problem for this group and why the Vikings were a wild card exit to the New York Giants. I think if the Vikings would have maybe even moved off after the Dallas Cowboys game when they got ran 40-3, we would have had a different result in the postseason. But why I was actually so concerned about Brian Flores not actually getting hired for the Vikes, because this interview was almost about a week and a half ago now, and I thought he was, since Vegas said he was the favorite to get the Cardinals head coaching job, I thought that was going to be it. I thought Brian Flores was going to be the next head coach for the Arizona Cardinals, and then the Vikings would have been having to sit there with Mike Pettin or scrambling for another defensive coordinator, because if we would have had Mike Pettin, and Mike Pettin would have been the next DC for the Vikes, it would have been a lot of the same. It would have been a lot of the same noise and a lot of the same just philosophy, and everything would have been pretty much similar to how it was this past season. But bringing in a guy like Brian Flores, and I'm going to be very curious to see what type of guy that Brian Flores wants to bring in. Could it be like a guy like a Cam Sutton, the corner from the Steelers, or maybe a Devin Bush, or maybe even a Kyle Van Noy, very versatile players that he could bring in on defense, or maybe a Duron Harmon that he could bring in at the safety position if Lewis Cine isn't fully ready to go when he gets back. Brian Flores, he's going to bring an aggressive style of play to Minnesota, and I'm very excited to see what this Vikings defense will look like, and I'm hoping it's just going to be completely different. I'm hoping when we look at the Vikings defense play this next year, just from my fans' perspective, we're going to be able to notice the change. We're going to be able to notice the difference between an Ed Donatell defense and a Brian Flores defense. I don't think this will be a hire where this is the next coordinator for the Vikings or next defensive coordinator for the Vikings for the next 5 seasons. I think this is a 1 to 2 year rental where he may flip this side of the football completely on its head, and this becomes a top 10, top 15 unit in the NFL. And like we were all saying last season, the Vikings just had a mediocre to average defense. This team can be special. The offensive side of the football is going to carry its own with guys like Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, and all the weapons they have. It's just defensively. They got to get it together, and this is the first step in the right direction, is hiring Brian Flores as your defensive coordinator. And if you guys haven't already, go give me a follow on Twitter. I'll be talking about the Vikings Vikings offseason this whole offseason long. We got draft coming up soon. Cut candidates. Vikings should be expecting to cut a lot of key names on this roster. Go give me a follow on Twitter at Pat Seatman NFL, and and I'll give you a follow back if you just say you came from this video. And I'll see you guys next time. Vikings, we got our guy Brian Flores, and as always, Skol Vikes.